What's going on, Tamers? It's me, OCD Organizer East, and I say that because in today's video I'm talking about a subject that is important to me but probably not important to a lot of folks out there, and that is the concept of storage. For folks who don't know, I border on what I would consider American Psycho levels of organization. Seiji, post up the incriminating evidence real quick there. When the Digimon card game first started, I had no problem finding space in my Japanese shoebox size apartment you see behind you for 4 copies of every single card. But as more and more sets have come out, and we've got EX sets and starter decks and advanced decks and reboot boosters, etc., I'm starting to run out of space. So now I'm having to make some really difficult decisions on which cards do I want to keep 4 of, which cards do I want to keep like 2 of, and which cards do I want to sell back to my local card shop. I don't know how other folks feel about this, but personally I think of my own local card shop kind of like a bank, where I sell them cards with the idea that they're just kind of holding on to them until I want to make a withdrawal. And the calculations that I make when I sell a card is, do I mind paying the withdrawal fee to get this card back? And so through this process of having to figure out which cards I want to sell versus which cards I want to keep, I did some research at looking at some of the strongest decks in the game in the past, and then kind of how their ratios changed for older cards that were included in those decks. And so in this video I want to talk about some strategies and rules that I use to figure out if I want to get rid of a card or not. Before we get into this though, I want to give a super quick but also super clear disclaimer. I don't care about the buying price of cards. I don't care about the selling price of cards. I don't care about the idea or content of a card market. I buy all of my cards from my local card shops in Akihabara, about 15 minutes from my apartment. And I sell all of my cards to my local card shop about a 10-minute walk from my apartment, whether or not it's the best price in town. This video, nor any other video I've ever made or plan to make, is ever created with the intention of affecting the price of cards anywhere in the world. I simply just want to play the game and have fun. Alright, so with that out of the way, now let's talk about my strategies for storage. Let's start with the really easy stuff. I think promos is probably the easiest place to begin, and that is promo cards. Keep 4 copies of every single promo card you get your hands on. You never want to have to kick yourself trying to find a promo card or having to buy a promo card whenever its price is like skyrocketed. Nobody wants that. The second really easy rule here is for advanced decks. We don't have a lot of advanced decks in the games, but if you do get cards from an advanced deck, I always recommend picking up 2 and then also just keeping 4 copies of everything you have. The Terriermon and Builtamon advanced decks included some fantastic cards, and honestly their use seems pretty timeless. When you look at cards like the new Rapidmon from the Terriermon starter deck, the Mega Gargomon Ace, as well as things like Ai and Mako and the Rivals Barrage option card and Tamer card respectively, those cards are great to just hold on to in case they get use in the future. Alright, so let's move on to something a little bit more challenging, and that is starter decks. Now, for this video, I'm separating the idea of starter decks and advanced decks into their own separate entities, just because I think advanced decks are made to be a little bit more powerful and let you fight at the upper levels of the game very quickly, whereas starter decks are there to kind of help you either learn rules or mechanics or just get into the game. And my rules for starter decks are pretty straightforward. Basically keep 2 of all the SRs, and this is because usually once a starter deck is released, soon after, those cards in the starter deck get more support, and the support that comes after them tends to be a little bit better. I guess is a way to entice people to buy cards, and that is when you take a look at, for example, BT14, BT15, those came right after the Agumon and Garurumon starter decks, and you could put those cards in to buff up those decks a bit more. This next rule is probably one you're going to hear across the board, and that is for options and tamer cards included in starter decks, you're pretty much going to keep 4 of all of them. These tend to be pretty useful, and you can splash into 1 or 2 decks here and there, but also the tamers as of late have been really good. When you take a look at the Matte and Tai tamers that were included in those starter decks for Garurumon and Greymon, they were amazing. Alright, so next up let's talk about the EX booster sets. Now for the secret rares, you're probably going to always want to keep 2 of them. The cards are pretty useful, but you never really need 4 copies. There's a few exceptions to this rule though, and that is EX1's Machinedramon, as well as the EX3 secret rares, which were Examon, which you needed 4 copies of, as well as the Imperialdramon Fighter Mode, the virus type, red, purple. I think you probably need more than 2, maybe 3 was a good number for him. But yeah, those examples are pretty far and few between, so again, for the most part, 2 copies is really good for the secret rares. Moving down the list to the SRs, these seem to be a little bit more timeless than the secret rares, which is kind of strange. Additionally, you don't want to have to kick yourself when you sell the card, and then later its price goes up by like 2 or 3 times, and you have to buy it back at like this super huge premium. Some of the cards that come to mind when I think about that are things like the X Antibody Protoform, as well as Leviamon. Looking at the options and the tamer cards, I would say here, just to be safe, it's a full keep of 4 of each of them, just because these cards tend to go the distance in terms of lifespan and usability. Like I mentioned before, cards like X Antibody Protoform, or even cards like, Analog Youth, which were printed way back in EX1 but are still seeing lots of use even today. You also have options like Sorai, or Ice Wall, or even Fireball, which are just generically good to slot into some of those colored decks like red or blue. Keep in mind, this rule pretty much only applies to the uncommons and up. For the most part, you can pretty much just lose the commons. You don't worry about those so much. And the last thing I'm going to touch on here for the EX booster sets is going to be the Digi Eggs. Just keep 4 copies of your eggs. They tend to be pretty useful in some capacity, so you always want to just have 4 copies in case you want to just either try it out in a deck or it ends up being a staple for a deck. And finally, let's take a look at the basic booster sets. Now, for the secret rares, these are kind of hard to judge, just because in the past I would have said, 2 copies of each secret rare is fine to keep, but recently, in the most recent booster sets, you kind of need 4 copies of everything. When you take a look at things like the Magnamon X and the Rapidmon X, as well as cards like the Greymon and the Takemikazuchi, you probably want 4 of each of those. You could probably make a case that Takemikazuchi you could put down to 3, but even still, 2 is just never enough. Unfortunately, my advice here is going to be a little bit unstable, but between 2 and 4 copies of the secret rares is probably a good place to be. If you're really worried about it, just grab 4 and then be done with the problem. Next, let's talk about the SRs. My general rule of thumb here is once a deck has gone past its prime, you can generally just keep 2 of the SRs and be good. Just because whenever that deck gets more support in the future, they're pretty much always going to reprint a new SR to take its place, and then you can just fill out the spots in the deck with the 2 copies of the old SRs that you kept. My only exception to this rule here is ace cards. Ace cards tend to be so generically useful that just holding on to 4 copies is always a good thing because you can use them outside of their respective traits or respective archetypes. And just to recap here for the SRs, a 2 keep for the regular SRs in a deck, and then the full 4 keep for the ace cards. For the Tamers, Options, and Digi Eggs, these cards for the uncommons and up just tend to be a full keep. They're just typically useful at the uncommon level, and so you never want to have yourself lacking one. And then finally, for all of the other cards that I haven't mentioned in the base sets, things like the regular commons, uncommons, and rares, the best piece of advice I can give you is that if it's a search card in any capacity, keep 4 copies of it. Outside of that, it really is up to your discretion. If you have the space and the wherewithal to keep those cards, feel free to do so. Or if you're just really interested in those cards' archetypes and you might want to use them in the future, or for your own spicy builds, keep them. Otherwise, you can probably just toss them and be okay. Sorry, when I say toss here, I mean sell. Chill. Don't throw away cards. That's a bad idea. Yeah, that way nobody wins that way. We just lose cards in the card pool. I don't know. Side tangent. The people who make the card art, the 3D card art, by cutting out multiple copies of a card, am I the only person who gets mad at that? It's how many? You use 30 rares to make this one 3D version of the card and its artwork, but that's 30 less rares people can use. Who does that? Maybe it's just me. I don't know. I appreciate art, but at the same time, destroying 30 copies of a card to make one 3D version of it just seems, I don't know, hateful. Is that the right word? So now that you know what cards you can probably get rid of safely and which cards you should probably hold on to, the question becomes, at what point did you make the decision to actually get rid of those cards? And for me, it's really hard to say. My best answer here, unfortunately, is when a deck is kind of past its prime. And again, the next question is, well, when does that happen? There's honestly no rule in Digimon. You take a look at some decks like Red Hybrid who are so long-lived that they're still in their prime since they were printed, I don't know, 7 sets ago, 10 sets ago. They've just been getting more and more support, and they've kind of just been riding that wave. Yeah, there's not a really clear-cut answer on this, unfortunately. Probably the safest way about this is when the deck is no longer getting any results at all in any tournaments for an entire set, it's probably a good idea to sunset the deck and, get rid of the cards you don't need. So all this comes with a really small caveat, upper right-hand corner, little asterisk, and that is that if a card just seems generically useful, just keep 4 copies of it. When you take a look at something like the Systemon Blanc from the Jesmon starter deck, those cards are really good. And the good thing about finding these really useful cards that are just generically good is that they're typically going to be white cards. So that's a really easy way to spot them if you're not sure. And then finally, I just want to mention that this is not foolproof. There may be times where you find yourself needing 4 copies of a booster set SR instead of the normal 2 copies are recommended. But keep in mind, this is made so that those kinds of situations are minimized while also making sure you have a reasonable amount of space for your storage. And so with that, we're going to bring this one to a close. Did I miss anything? What rules do you folks have for managing your storage and choosing which cards to get rid of versus which cards to keep? Let me know in the comments below. I'm sure your fellow tamers will also appreciate the tips. Anyways, folks, I'm going to get out of here. Before you get out of here, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.